This is the last portion of our marathon.
To microphone.
Take the mic.
Good morning. This is the last stop of our 3 or 4 day marathon. Thank you for staying us all the time. Today we have three speakers, and my duty is to present them according to these CVs that they gave to us. Before I do this, I would just like, I don't want to forget to say thank you to our translators, without whom we will not be able to communicate properly. Girls, thank you very much for your job. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. Good. Now, would you like to sit? You're the first.
This is the first.
Would you like to sit there? This is Okay, Aleš Javec is a research professor at the Institute of Philosophy Scientific Research Center of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts in Ljubljana. He also teaches, rather globally, in Ljubljana, Koper and Shanghai. He told me I should read the list, at least the titles of his book, but if I do this, he will have only 5 minutes to talk. But nevertheless, I will do it.
No, you're the boss.
No. No, I'm not the boss, I'm also a colleague. So, and I mean, it's frustrating for me what he wrote until now, and he's younger. His publications include Ideology and Art of Modernism, published in Ljubljana in '91, then Postmodernism and the Post-Socialist Condition, Politicized Art under Late Socialism in 2003, Love and at the Last Sight, Avant-garde Modernism and the End of Art, published in Ljubljana and Belgrade, Aesthetics and Politics of Modernism, Ljubljana 2009, Postmodernism, Post-Socialism and Beyond, very good title, Newcastle 2009, Aesthetic Revolutions of the 20th Century, Avant-garde Movements by Duke, forthcoming in 2015, Aesthetics and Politics of Absence, Avant-garde and State of Exceptions, on the way, under preparation, under construction, and Modernism reunited.
Revisited.
Revisited. Okay, now you have only 5 minutes to talk.
I'll just follow your practice from yesterday.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to Bojana, and thank you to all of you for coming to this morning session. Thank you also to Piotr Piotrowski for the invitation and to the organizers of this conference, of course. What I will present today here is a kind of an offshoot of a rather long article that was published a couple of months ago in the American journal Boundary 2, with which you may be acquainted. I'll begin so as not to waste much time. So let me begin by Aristotle from Book 1 of the Politics, and I quote, "Man, says Aristotle, is political because he possesses speech, a capacity to place the just and the unjust in common, whereas all the animal has is a voice to signal pleasure and pain. If then the people, individuals and groups, or national communities in Eastern Europe, for example, are successful in making and having their voice heard, this voice stretching from the socio-political to the artistic and cultural realms, then they have taken a political stance and have effected action toward others, themselves, and their place in the world as subjects. And I quote again, this time from Jacques Rancière. Politics begins when those who were destined to remain in the domestic and invisible territory of work and reproduction and were prevented from doing anything else take the time that they have not in order to affirm that they belong to a common world. Unquote. Rancière's claim concerns French workers from the 19th century, but I believe it can be equally applied to the post-colony and to Eastern Europe. While other issues of post-colonialism, Orientalism, nation, identity, hybridity find limited resonance when applied to Eastern Europe, the issue of the voice carries in this context more weight, for it overdetermines other issues that have been just mentioned. It is widely agreed that Eastern Europe possessed its highest level of recognizability after World War II, namely in the period of the Cold War. The concept of Eastern Europe is not something eternal, but designates the historical experience of the period of the Cold War. It was Cold War that produced the predominant 20th century Western image of the European political East as an opaque territory that is submerged into ideology. Between the late 40s and 1990s, Eastern Europe thus represented an apparently well-defined but little-known chunk of Europe with its specific political position, its lived worlds, its specific characteristics vis-à-vis the Soviet Union on the one hand and Western Europe on the other. The Eastern European self-representations diverged substantially from the ones generated in the West, with these two being mostly construed on the basis of misconceptions and misrepresentations. The Eastern European population had a voice, but in the perception of the Westerners, this voice too was often only sound-making. An illustrative example of this situation was art, and I quote from Peter Georgi, "In the Soviet art world, nobody knew enough about the West, and in the West, nobody wanted to know much about contemporary Soviet art world. This lack of information caused Easterners to entertain mistaken ideas about the decontextualized pieces of Western art and to underestimate themselves while admiring everything that came from the other side of the world. The members of the Soviet art world wanted to learn everything about Western art history. For the Easterners, abstract expressionists, for example, signified the undamaged freedom of art and the right of personal expression, but in the Soviet art world, nobody had any idea about the origin of the broad success of the New York School and about the local context of their struggles against the market." Some have claimed that Eastern Europe emerged as a discursive construct in the Enlightenment, representing the West's intermediary other, neither fully civilized nor fully savage. Thus, a commentator notes that as the European Union expands eastward, it casts Eastern Europeans as uncultured, economically underdeveloped, politically unsavvy, and therefore in need of assistance to bring them up to European standards. There exist also sentiments of Eastern superiority. Already Russian futurists, for example, regarded themselves as battling the West, while contemporary Cuban art critic Gerardo Mosquera claims that, and I quote, "the Third World made Western culture," unquote. Thereby bringing to mind the words of the avant-garde Serbian poet from the 1920s, Lubomir Micic, who strove to, and I quote, "rejuvenate Madame Europe," unquote. In Eastern Europe, the popular stigma in the 80s and 90s was not how to determine one's own identity and representation, as it is usually claimed, under changed political and social circumstances, but how to join Western Europe, understood as a phantasmatic repository of positive values that were to complement and not replace the then current socialist values of the region. This naive view has been often documented in culture. In the lyric Democracy from 1989 by the Romanian Balinescu Quartet, we hear the obsessive and almost conjuring refrain, "We want to be democratic." As we hear the Bosnian Huso, a character in the Slovenian film Rams and Mammoths from 1985, exclaim, and I quote, "Aren't we Europe? Who is then? Who killed Ferdinand in Sarajevo?" Unquote. Who speaks today for and in the name of Eastern Europe? In which way is Eastern Europe today, that is in the 1989 period, represented by native experts, namely scholars and researchers from this region on the one hand, and by those from the Western outside on the other. This distinction is relative. Native scholars frequently turn into expatriate outsiders, often becoming the best representatives and the most eloquent and sensitive voices of the native countries and cultures in the global West. As Edward Said observed in relation to himself, they usually also retain, and I quote, some organic connection with the place from which they originally came, unquote. Often this is all that is needed to reach across the gap that separates an insider from an outsider, which in the eyes of a foreigner is of limited relevance, while in the eyes of the population in question, the bridging of such gaps is of utmost importance, for it forms the lived cement of the Althusserian ideology, we could say, holding together their imagined communities. This then is not only an issue of factography, but of the immediacy of an individual culture and the ways in which its people organize their enjoyment. Natives can be experts sharing the academic universe on an equal footing, or they may be at best native informants for the first world intellectuals interested in the voice of the other. It was culture and art that in the post-1989 period best represented Eastern Europe. By saying this, I'm not claiming that political gestures or industrial and other products did not aid in recognizing a certain country, nation or culture of the region and help construct its identity, but that such products from Eastern Europe are recognizable with difficulty and are under the current global conditions increasingly rare. The only Eastern European product that still springs to mind is the Czech car Škoda, but even this one is today a joint venture with Volkswagen. The recognizable national items are thus those that can sometimes be found in specialized sections of European and American supermarkets. Czech Pilsner beer, Zvak the Hungarian bitter, Tokaj wine from Hungary, or Zubrovka the Polish vodka.
Great.
Art and culture belong among the most successful forms of what is also a political representation of Eastern Europe. In 1932, the Slovenian literary critic Josip Vidmar suggested that since Slovenia was so small, it could leave a mark in Europe only in the arena of culture and art, and not in politics or economy. The capital of Slovenia, Ljubljana, was thus, Vidmar claimed, to become another Athens or Florence, and I quote from Vidmar, renowned for its culture, making mark in the world in this way, unquote. Vidmar's proposal was not original. For a century and a half earlier, similar ideas were developed by Friedrich Schiller in Weimar, which too was a small community, namely a duchy of some 10,000 inhabitants, where Herder and Goethe preceded Schiller as court intellectuals, with Schiller developing there the idea of an aesthetic state. In 1991, the Slovenian group Irvin organized an exhibition in the Museum of Modern Art in Ljubljana titled Slovenian Athens, thereby reenacting Vidmar's idea from before the World War II and transforming a political utopian project into an artistic one, and proving that the idea of leaving a mark in Europe only in the arena of culture and art still lived on. Between the two wars, major parts of Eastern Europe were firmly a part of Europe as such. Once again, it is culture and art that prove this point best. And I quote from Mansbach, the creativity that has taken place and was flourishing on the eastern periphery of Europe more than 3/4 of a century ago was appreciated by forward-looking artists, critics, and cultural commentators in France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and elsewhere in the West, unquote. The intellectual Europe was aware of artistic achievements that spread not only from Vienna, Paris, or Berlin, but also from Eastern Europe and its cities such as Budapest, Bucharest, Belgrade, Prague, Łódź, Riga, or Pécs. Artists such as František Kupka, Witkiewicz, August Černigoj, Ljubomir Micic, or theorists such as Karl Teiger and Jan Mukarzewski were a part of the all-European intelligentsia. They remained in their respective countries, and while others, such as Brancusi, Janko, Cera, Kostrovitsky, also known as Apollinaire, or Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, emigrated to Paris, Zurich, or New York. The latter became world famous, while the former have been resurrected from oblivion only in recent decades. And I quote from Mansbach again, Why is it that today these avant-garde figures and movements, which earlier in the century overcame their peripheral location to assume a critical and formative role in the genesis of advanced art, are almost totally forgotten and overlooked? The retreat into relative historical obscurity was not the result of a Western program of willful ignorance or of cultural chauvinism. Rather, it was in large measure the consequence of political, social, and even cultural developments in each of the respective nations of this vast expanse of Eastern Europe. In the immediate years following 1989, the Second World, namely the former socialist countries of Europe, stood out as a territory where historic events were taking place. In this dynamic time, political ideas, art and culture flourished, causing many in the West to anticipate a new cultural paradigm to emerge from the East, expressing or voicing new possibilities for Europe as such. Its artistic and cultural impact was expected to resemble that of the time of the October Revolution, when the Russian avant-garde influenced Western art through its ideas and artists. This time, the impact of the emergent art from the East had a lesser influence on the West European or the American art, this being so not only due to the highly developed art in Europe and the United States, but also to the competing artists, competing in inverted commas, artists and trends from elsewhere in the world, especially from Asia and Latin America. This time it was in art that a similarity between the post-colonial world and the post-socialist one emerged, thereby proving that today the world, that of art included, is one, namely capitalist, global, universal, on-the-move, hybrid, and English-speaking. In 1992, the Croatian artist Mladen Stilinovic captured well this global prevalence of English by creating an installation in the form of a statement saying, "An artist who cannot speak English is no artist." The same went for other spheres of life, theory, art criticism, and cultural institutions. It was also for this reason that some Eastern European intellectuals found anthropology and post-colonial studies so suitable, for they allowed them to start from a clean slate and not be burdened by European linguistic and cultural intricacies. It was, as Frederick Jameson claimed, that for the first time in history, whether we call it postmodern or not, the logic, in the sense of a cultural paradigm that is, of the American culture conquered the world. During the period preceding and immediately following the fall of the so-called really existing socialism, altogether encompassing approximately a decade, culture blossomed, often serving as the vehicle and voice of political representation and articulation. Thus, the singing protest between 1987 and 1991 led to the political transformation in Estonia that materialized in the so-called singing revolution, which then spread also to the other two Baltic countries, with writers such as Václav Havel in Prague, the former Hungarian President Gönc, or the Foreign Minister of Slovenia Dimitri Rupel, and philosophers. The Prime Minister of Serbia, Zoran Djindjic, for example, became national and international political figures. While Polish, Hungarian or Slovenian art was flourishing in the 90s, art from most of the Balkans became internationally visible only a decade later, when the economic and political circumstances made possible its production and global proliferation. Similarly to contemporary Chinese art, art from Eastern Europe too mirrored the dynamism of the so-called Wild East and the ensuing socialist countries. One consequence of the transition was thus the increased artistic production, with the other being the theoretical and critical apprehension of its specificity and thereby its reducibility to the Western or other models. In the 90s, Western critics, curators and authors discovered the art of Eastern Europe and the related one from Russia. A series of art exhibitions took place across Europe and the United States, with these events soon being followed by some important publications covering the same kind of artworks. At the beginning, the authors of such publications were authors from the West, aided by Eastern Europeans. It was at that stage that local scholars, critics, and curators began to complement the work of their Western colleagues, partly in tandem and partly alone. As in the case of anthropological authors, in the case of contemporary art from Eastern Europe too, it was the locals or natives who started to publish scholarly and comprehensive works about Eastern Europe, but written in the Anglo-American style and idiom. Terry Smith argues, and I quote, that during the 20th century, artists did not identify themselves as Eastern or Central European, except for purposes of irony or parody, unquote. He also draws our attention to the Irving group from Slovenia that initiated the book East Art Map, which was compiled with the assistance of a team of art historians, artists, critics, and curators active in Eastern and Central Europe, who felt the need to counterattack the Western view of Eastern Europe as a terra incognita. Soon, mostly in the 90s and especially in the new millennium, art from Eastern Europe visibly started to resemble that of the West. New social, economic, and political circumstances conditioned the emergent art of Europe. Eastern European art had its satisfaction. It finally started to resemble art from the West and from global art world, but became lost in this process. The period of an exceptional time for art came to an end. Let me draw some conclusions. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and in the new millennium, the representation of Eastern Europe was, and partly remains, regionally determined and recognizable mainly in the areas of art and culture. In recent decades, Eastern Europe has made its mark in Europe and globally, often with and through art, and carried this out at the same time as a part of the ex-Soviet Second World and as a part of the region called Eastern Europe. The former often determined its imagery and artistic expression, while the latter expressed its national and historical specifics. Both worlds made up the actual art world of the region, which in this way voiced its existential and historical position in the world. Taking into consideration the previous remark that the region is, beside history and language, as crucial vehicles of nationality, among the outsiders, and in other words, foreigners, recognized by art, we could almost say that in this broad area of Europe, Josip Widmar's idea that small cultures and nations can make a mark in the world through culture has, at least for a decade or so, become true. This would have been the viewpoint of the European and global West if it is there that such art was accorded an important place in the national community and was a marker of general development of the presence and the articulation of the voice, not only of the artist, but of his or her community as well. Looking from the inside, matters appear different, for from that perspective, art was often regarded as a luxury that the common people can neither afford nor want to possess, for they don't understand it, except in the case of ethnic or popular art, such as choir singing and similar amateur activity, or kitsch. In the region, there was a long history of the conflation of popular and socialist art, usually also designated as surrealist art, bypassing or opposing the urban and cosmopolitan avant-garde. While every country has its Norman Rockwell, not everywhere has such art become the official artistic doctrine, as was the case with socialist realism between 1932 and 1989. From the insight of the national or other community, avant-garde art was prior to 1989 often regarded as foreign. Much of the art produced in the region in the 90s was obliged to face both ways. In this, as well as in many other respects, this art resembled that of the global Third World. The importance ascribed to art in Eastern Europe occurred during the decade or two around 89 and helped to erect the global image of the region as cultured and ripe with new political and cultural ideas. In this respect, countries such as the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Hungary, the Baltic countries, and Poland stood out with art in Bulgaria, Romania, and Albania, never attaining the same position. In the former socialist countries, art often possessed a similar relevance both at home and abroad, thereby aiding in articulating and expressing the voice of an individual or of national community. After this initial period, politics took over and art slowly lost its previous relevance in nation building and similar endeavors, expressed well by the phrase "artists go home." Today, after the end of the heroic period around 89, art has lost its previous importance and has in this respect joined the art of much of Western Europe. In the future, the politics of representation of Eastern Europe may not matter in the same way as it did in the past. To quote Maria Todorova, from a long-term perspective, Eastern Europe is slowly vanishing. In a period of the next 10, 20, 50 years, it will probably become a part of the European institutional apparatus. Unquote. Thank you.
Alex, thank you very much. Besides a good paper, I am grateful to you because you were so disciplined concerning the time. Now I have the pleasure to introduce next colleague. Magdalena Radomska.
Where is your mic?
I'm sorry. PhD in Magdalena is a post-Marxist art historian. I don't believe that I ever heard this term, post-Marxist, and I'm very, very glad about it. Before I give you the microphone, you know, when the wall fell down, I had a good friend from London, Gray Watson, who felt terrorized by British Marxist art historians, and he said there were so many around that you couldn't get any other voice. So, and when Wall was gone, he said, finally, Marxism is dead. And I tried to convince him that Marxism is theory, you know, and the problem, what we do with theory in practice, or what was done in practice, is completely another story. Now, I'm curious about what you have to say, but I have also to add what you did so far. Sorry. So, post-Marxist art historian and historian of philosophy, assistant professor at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, author of texts published in 8 languages. She holds a PhD in art history and has received scholarship in the Cortlandt Institute of Art in London, the Hungarian Academy of Sciences in Budapest, and the Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. I'm sorry, my Hungarian is non-existent. She was a director and lecturer in the course named Writing Humanities after the fall of communism. This was held in 2009 at CAU in Budapest. Recently, her book, The Politics of Movement of Hungarian Neo-avant-garde from 1966 to 1980 has been published, and she is currently engaged in a research on the post-communist art, on the post-communist art in post-communist Europe, and criticism of capitalism in art. I cannot wait for the book, Critic of Capitalism. So the title of the book is the plural subject, Art and Crisis after 2008, and her second PhD is as her second PhD, she's writing a monograph on post-Marxism. She's a member of both Polish and Hungarian ICA and editor of magazine Czas Kultury. Czas is okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
Czas.
Welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to present today part of my book, which is about to be published. It's about art in crisis. So I chose an example from Central Eastern Europe in order to introduce the problem of criticism of capitalism after 2008, a global capitalism, and I framed it according to the subject of the conference. So I'm starting to quote Marx, and this is from The Capital, Volume 3, Chapter 6. And I quote, "From the standpoint of higher economic form of society, private ownership of the globe by a single individuals will appear quite as absurd as private ownership of one man by another. Even a whole society, nation, or even a simultaneously existing societies taken together are not the owners of the globe. There are only its possessors, manufactuaries, and like boni patres familias, they must hand it down to succeeding generation in an improved condition. And that's, and a quote, that's from Marx. The notion of the globe appears in Marx's writings already in the Communist Manifesto, in the very first chapter elaborating the relationship between bourgeoisie and proletarians. According to Marx, the cosmopolitan character of the society, defined by its production and consumption, stems from the, and I quote, the need of constantly expanding market for its products that chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, argues Marx, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. I quote, in place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, continues the German philosopher, we have intercourse and very direction, universal interdependence of nations. Notwithstanding, end of quote, notwithstanding the bitterness of his diagnosis, Marx was able to acknowledge that it delimits, and I quote, the national one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness, end of quote, and claimed that it affects both material and intellectual production. However, Marx seemed quite appreciative for the appearance of the word literature and culture as the outcome of the process. He diagnosed as essential the coupling of, and I quote, possessing the means of production and facilitating means of communication, end of quote, and ascribed it to bourgeoisie. He also finds it responsible for subjecting the country to the rule of the towns. It, I mean bourgeoisie, has created enormous cities, Marx argues, has greatly increased the urban population and compared with rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Just it has made the country dependent on the towns, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on civilized ones, nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West, end of quote. Contrary to bourgeoisie, which is in the text of Marx characterized with the terms of global, imperial and centralized, the proletariat is not described as global, but narrated to as a mass, which seems to be significant concerning the bourgeoisie or capitalist, or thus deprived of the physical existence, which is licensed to object and the globe, while the proletariat has its material existence, direct access to it, which is not mediated by its stance towards capital. Consequences of the text are crucial. Although proletariat is forced to follow the means of production, which are invested globally in order to sell their labor power, possession of which, according to Marx, constitutes it, the proletariat, as a subject, the global capital contributes to the mobility of proletarian masses. The crucial critique of the global violence of capitalism, as Paul Leblanc aptly puts it, is rooted in the reading of Marx, both his Communist Manifesto and his Capital. Originates in her book, a book of Rosa Luxemburg, The Accumulation of Capital. In the text, Luxemburg contributes significantly to the Marxist notion of inner contradictions of capitalism by pointing out that capitalism appears as parasitic on non-capitalist economies and therefore limited by its own claim for the globe. Thus, the development of the productive forces, argues Luxemburg, is arrested. One may conclude the spread of the masses of proletariat, although reinforced by its poverty and cheapened labor force, is though privileged over the expansion of capitalism, as its mechanism does not depend on its parasitic inclinations. The globalism does appear as essentially arrested, and this is my term for arrested globalism. In my paper, I would like to introduce the variation of the notion of proletariat, namely the plural subject rooted in the philosophy of Alain Badiou, which exceptionally in the domain of post-Marxism is rooted in the set theory. Nobody refers to the set theory but Badiou in post-Marxism. Already in the 80s, so it is Théorie du sujet from 1982 and being an event from 1988. After the crisis of 2008, the notion re-emerged in his book In the Praise of Love, which I'm interested in, which offers the concept of the essentially plural subject, common for love and revolution. By essentially plural, I mean that it is not a result of adding 1 plus 1, but this is essentially plural. It's common for love and revolution because it's like proletarian subject, which is born as plural, let's say. The next part of the text is titled "The Factory Has Moved to Your Country." Thus, a West goes global when it goes East. And this is a paradox which is illustrated by, let me skip, Bogdan Perzhowski. This is not visible right here, but he made a work which is a drawing of a factory and the worker in front of the factory, and the sign says the factory has moved to your country. So the paradox he illustrates the paradox when East finally made it to the West is somewhere else, and where it went global. In his book, The Year of Dreaming Dangerously, which title refers both to emancipatory and gloomy dreams dreamt by the societies in 2011, reflecting upon the Arab Spring, Sławoj Žižek argues, and I quote, "Although almost everyone enthusiastically supported this democratic explosion, there is a hidden struggle for their appropriation going on. The official circles and most of the media in the West celebrate them as the same thing as the pro-democracy velvet revolutions in Eastern Europe. A desire for Western liberal democracy, a desire to become like the West. This is why uneasiness arises when one sees that there is another dimension at work in protest here. The dimension usually referred to as the demand for social justice. This struggle for reappropriation is not only a question of interpretation, but has crucially practical consequences. It is essential to notice that while it was obvious for Egyptian people that the revolution constitutes a precious commodity which can be stolen, they blamed Tantawi and the army for selling it to the West. These are my words already. Revolutions of 1989 were sold quite meekly. Therefore, the financial crisis of 2008, in my interpretation, interpreted by many artists as the crisis of capitalism, seems to be the crucial for the reflection upon the sold, lost revolution of '89. Because there is no such thing, practically doesn't exist in the discourse, professional discourse, the discourse of the revolutions of '89. It's only in the case of Romania when it was very bloody, but I think it's a mistake, and the crisis is a chance to reevaluate this discourse. The next part, a choir of soloists. This is a case of Egyptian street art when Bahia Shebab, within her works No and Thousand Times No, which are done since 2010, this is the right part, this part, claims that no for the stealing of revolution. So this proves that Egyptian artists are very careful about this, about the stealing of revolution. One of the early example, and this is my only example before 2008, of criticism of capitalism introduced by Lithuanian couple Nomeda and Gediminas Urbonas is constituted with the word karaoke. Artists ask employees of the last state-owned bank to perform the song Money, Money, Money by ABBA. In the video produced by the couple, one can see that singers do not develop any contact with each other. They are gazing at the screen with lyrics, making eyes to the video camera in sensual, almost erotic way. Although they are singing together, they are not constituting the choir, rather a ridiculous group of soloists, captivated in one-to-one relationship with a screen, which can be interpreted as alienating one-to-one relationship with capital. In his book Communist Hypothesis, Alain Badiou, discussing the TV spectacle of the financial crisis, argues that one can access the real only by turning from the screen and looking around in the screening room. The gesture described by Badiou seems to have a status of constituting the horizontal surface of communication, thus breaking the alienation caused by one relationship with the screen. In the work by Lithuanian couple, the capital is represented by the language of capital. English lyrics on the prompter, which en place identify the capital with erotic object. Because the lyric says that I need to get me a wealthy man. The work both problematizes the transformation in terms of subject, commune, individual, society, and questions the necessity of its equation with capitalism. Moreover, the work appears as problematization of the contradictory concept of the global subject defined as the choir of soilists and seizing one of the communist socialist nature. In 2013, this is me wearing a mask by Szent-Juby. In 2013, Hungarian artist Tomasz Szent-Juby curated his own retrospective exhibition in Ludwig Museum in Budapest. The exhibition of the artist had the status of the event defined by Alain Badiou as a rupture which opens up truth, intervention, as something that creates the condition of its own existence, as a Marxist did. Szent-Juby not only peremptorily refused to rearrange exhibition halls destroyed after the dismantling of the previous exhibition, he also demanded for the exhibition to be free of charge. The idea, however, turned out to be impossible to be realized because the structure of Hungarian tax system. Tickets therefore costed some forints in order to cover the taxation connected with the expenses tied to the fact of their physical existence. Szent-Juby thus revealed the entanglement of the culture into the system of its financing. Works by Szent-Juby were exhibited on walls with substantial lessening of paint and plaster. Although the budget was limited, as the artist worked as the curator and the exhibition did not require the additional work, visitors were still forced to pay the tax. The gesture of the artist tied him directly to his own labor force, which was neither turned into a commodity nor isolated from the labor force of workers usually responsible for arrangement of the exhibition. Szent-Juby exposed the work of the workers as undone, defining thus the white cube as the oppressive structure concealing the work under the layers of the white paint. The action of Szent-Juby emphasized the proletarian identity of the artist and had a status of creating the exhibition not only within the symbolic register of the museum, but also in its socio-economical real. For the opening of the exhibition, Szent-Juby organized the performance, handing in to visitors a paper, literally poorly done face masks, with the visual representation of Rosa Luxemburg. Guests were closed in the exhibition room, sitting idly until the authorities of the museum reacted. The very idea of the accumulating people in the room can be interpreted with the notion introduced by Luxemburg. The artist accumulated people in the form of the gesture parallel to the accumulation of capital, asking about the possible limits, status and consequences of such an accumulation. And shortly I would like to present some other stuff which I have in book, and this is done by Janos Sugar. To me it's a kind of a Sistine Chapel of the Marxist, let's say, art history, because it's like a worker's hand. Within the series Art Workers Won't Kiss Us, which he done, And this is done by Igor Grubic, artist from Zagreb, who discovered dirty traces of poems on the walls in Zagreb, and he decided to make this kind of traces on the walls of parliament in Zagreb. So he transferred them here. He works also as a worker, wearing the costume of a worker. This is not a costume because it has also the status of being a proletariat. And like this, he could be very effective in many actions. For instance, he made red water in the fountain while George Bush visited Zagreb. It was very guarded and protected area, but he managed to get there because he was invisible as a worker. So it's very interesting how he is defining his work, artistic work, as a real social work of proletariat. And now a passage of about Polish artist Franciszek Orłowski. In Poland in 2008, artist Franciszek Orłowski addressed the issue of global versus communist plural subject with his action Kiss of Love. On streets of his hometown, Poznań, Orłowski took an action of exchanging his clothes with homeless people. Thus, Orłowski performed what can be identified with a Marxist deed. In his book The Actuality of Communism, in the chapter entitled In Search of the Act, Bruno Bostyles discusses the act proper, which had been introduced by Sławomir Žižek. Bostyles confronts definition of the act explicit in various texts by Slovenian philosopher. One of the numerous factors of the definition is constituted by the act before the act. That is to say, I quote, what we might call the primordial act involved in the real genesis of coming into being of the subject, end of quote. The act before the act can be interpreted with the notion of the Marxist deed. Klara Zetkin recalls in the beginning it was the deed as the motto of the first international constituted by history itself, claiming that, I quote, the founding of the Communist International was preceded by the deed of the greatest historic import, to wit, the November Revolution in Russia. End of quote. Therefore, the act before the act ought to be interpreted as revolutionary act. Franciszek Orłowski clearly inscribed his action in the revolutionary discourse. He sewn together the collected clothes into the form of a tent entitled Project Zero, which is here, creating thus the patchwork shelter. The work of art seems to establish an important point of discussion with the book The Class of Civilizations and Remaking the World Order by political scientist Samuel Huntington. The infamous part of the text reads, and I quote, during the Cold War, the world was divided into first, second and third worlds. Those divisions are no longer relevant, end of quote. One might say that Orłowski is sewing the tent out of Huntingtonian patchwork of civilizations. The tent stinks with the smell of those excluded from the society, with the figure of overpopulation as introduced by Thomas Malthus. The gesture of Orłowski seems to be parallel to the very act of Marx, who introduced a crucial polemics with Malthus with the notion of the surplus population. According to James Bell, Marx shows the surplus population is a necessary product of accumulation. So we accumulate capital, and that's why there is no place, no shelter, no everything for everyone. Claiming further, I shall call this demonstration of the consequences of surplus population for the accumulation of capital Marxist functional theory of surplus population. These two notions, overpopulation and surplus population, are almost identical. They differ as tools of interpretation of a public sphere. Marx disclosed the Malthusian theory as ideological, that is, conditioned by a false consciousness indicating the category of overpopulation as crucially connected to the production of surplus value and accumulation of capital. The parallel gesture was executed by Franciszek Orłowski, who created the patchwork which within the context of the humanities can be interpreted as a representation of post-colonial neoliberal society, essentially different. The model disregarding the primacy of economical and social difference serves as a foundation of the different but not differentiated society. Orłowski seems to reflect upon the fact whether the model can be useful as a shelter, whether within the crisis the society should make over its own paradigms. The very gesture of exchanging the clothes with homeless people needs to be considered as a crucial attempt of establishing the plural subject. Orłowski simply does not give away his clothes to those in need. He also defined himself as in need. For the exhibition Splendor Tkaniny, the splendor of the textile, in Zachęta in spring of 2013, Orłowski sewed the patchwork curtain hanging within the main entrance to the exhibition. The work of art entitled Entrance Enclosure functioned as a barrier due to its repulsive smell. There were a possibility of entering the exhibition through the side door, although the operation of Orłowski was significant. It recalls the action Imponderabilia, conducted by Marina Abramovich and her partner Ulaj in 1977 in Galeria Comunale d'Arte Moderna in Bologna. Abramovich and Ulaj, standing naked within the frame of the entrance door, forced the visitors of the exhibition to enter its space by squeezing between their naked bodies. The very gesture had the status of the interference in the intimate relationship between two lovers, maintaining the eye contact all along. On the other hand, the act predefined the viewer of the exhibition, compelling them to enter its space with their sexual bodies, defined thus not merely, as in the White Cube, as a career of apparatus of perception. The entrance of the exhibition designed by Orłowski seems to function as a parallel gesture. Viewers are being equipped with their bodies bearing the economical and social status as well as their political views. The work of Polish artists raises the essential question concerning the ethical dimension of the urban space. The work gesture of drawing the curtain is strictly connected to the Polish context with the tradition of hanging the entrance enclosure in churches. Thus, the opening of the drapery reveals the ethical system hidden behind it and set in motion by the very gesture of walking through. The ethical system in operation seems to be identical with the one introduced by French philosopher Alain Badiou in order to oppose what he calls the ethics of the difference. Badiou claims that its founding principle is the law of funding authority, which amounts to recognition of the other, against racism, which would deny this other, or to the ethics of the difference against substantialism, nationalism, which would exclude immigrants, or sexism, which would deny feminine being, or multiculturalism against the imposition of the undefined model of behavior and intellectual approach. According to Badiou, the imposition of undefined model of behavior and according to Badiou, the whole ethical predication based upon recognition of the other should be purely and simply abandoned. For the real question, continues the author, and it's extraordinarily difficult one, is much more the recognizing of the same. Badiou opts for what could be called an essentially plural subject, that's of revolutionary subject, such as proletarian, which is capable of the Marxist deed. Franciszek Orłowski seems to advocate the plural subject as well. Therefore, in his action Kiss of Love, Orłowski was not content with giving away his own clothes to the homeless people. He felt the need to wear the clothes in return in order to establish the plural subject. And yes, I will conclude and I will show some.
I can listen for 1 hour.
Thank you. I will conclude. So I have some also example by István Kantor, because my question here raised in the final part of the paper is how to criticize globalism, or how we can, by Piotr Piotrowski is asking the question of alter globalism. So we are using the network of globalism in order to criticize the mechanism of global capitalism, for instance. So how we should use visually the network. So, for instance, István Kantor, this is the performance How to Explain Revolution to a Broken Robot. So, I mean, a global system which is very mechanized, He was, for instance, selling this kind of small resembling objects, resembling the Chinese workers' objects at the entrance to the Biennale in Tallinn, which I attended, and which is also included a review in the paper. And
Elena, this must be the last. Now half an hour is gone.
okay. Oh, sorry. So so the last is this. This is the work of Estonian artist. And so I posed the question at the end, taken from the Antonio Negri's book, Goodbye, Mr. Socialism. Is it possible to criticize global capitalism within his own notions, within his own structures and procedures, or not? Because Negri is claiming that capitalism can be criticized within the inside position, and I'm not so much convinced. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, before Laszlo gets to his seat, I can read something about him. Laszlo Bekke is a professor and up to 2011 director, earliest senior research fellow of the Institute of Art History of the Research Center for the Humanities, Hungarian Academy of Sciences, Budapest, professor at the Hungarian University of Fine Arts, a lecturer in several Hungarian institutions. He had been teaching at the University of Lyon to Louis Lumière Hungarian Institution. This was in 1889, and he was chief curator of the 19th or 20th century collections at the Hungarian National Gallery from 88 to 95. And then he was also general director of Mucsarnok Kunsthalle in Budapest. He was also, he curated numerous exhibitions, including Hungarian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in '96. He's written and published and performed, this is not written here, published books on art, 20th century theory, contemporary types. He's of course a member of ICA, and so on, and Chevalier d'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres de la République Française, etc. And I would like to introduce him this morning, just Laszlo, the friend. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We know each other from the cell.
Very kind, Bojana. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to first tell you and I confess that I am very bad in English. I use a kind of lingua franca, which is a kitchen English. So I think it is very, very easy to understand. My thesis is, first I wanted to speak about post-contemporary art, but I try to forget it and better to speak about the post-contemporary condition. If you check the Wikipedia and all stuff in Google, which I did yesterday, you find some very, very controversial post-contemporary definitions, which are mostly fakes. So there is a guy who started that he already in 1995 invited the post-contemporary, but it's not true. I introduced post-contemporary 2 years ago, and also my students told me 1 year ago that Frederick Jensen started with this idea as post-contemporary intervention and is a kind of Jamesonian unconscious discourse, but I would add he doesn't understand exactly what is post-contemporary. Anyhow, post-contemporary is not, it is PC or PCA when we speak about post-contemporary art, but PC is nothing to do with political correctness and not a personal computer. PC is comparable with a book of Walter Auer in the early 70s. By the way, he was a secret name of a Czech person. PCA, which meant project art, conceptual art, and actionism. I speak about political, I speak about post-contemporary. It was born from the idea that contemporary art is already very tired. It started already about the 80s and get very boring. He can consult a kind of very clever little booklet, very contemporary, with the title Very Contemporary. They are using excursions in the Meuse-Rhine Euregion in the name of contemporary by bus. It also means that contemporary art is a little bit tired. Characteristics of contemporary art were, for the beginning, multiculti, gender-orientated, social sensibility or sensitivity, new liberal, globalization-oriented, sometimes against globalization, again, sometimes for globalization. These all characteristics are not rejected by post-contemporary. On the contrary, they are supported by us, but overwritten and updated. Art history, at first, is necessary to write a short history of the prehistory of the post-contemporary. When I made a third or fourth forward to my book, Elképzelés, or idea or imagination, very kindly published already by Transit Hungary and edited by Esther Szakács, I wrote, today experts of neo-conceptual and post-conceptual art are interested already in the origins of conceptual art. This is also a symptom of the last period of postmodern and contemporary art. The writer of this text, which is me, is working now on the principles of the most recent trend, post-contemporary art. Again, as Piotr Piotrowski put on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of CCI in Krakow, especially in Eastern Europe, we have to accept that we are living in a globalized situation where lingua franca is English, and we have to overcome the post-socialism. And then I added, that's all right, only we have let grow local and regional differences or difference in terms on data. Later on, At the ICA Congress, titled White Spaces and Black Holes in Košice, Piotrowski developed his theory, peripheries unite, and thank you, and towards an art history, parallel art histories as a comparatistics between East Europe and sometime with Latin America. See our conversation in the review Harrington. For me, post-contemporary is not or couldn't be simply a new art direction or art trend or tendency, but a condition. So as Lyotard explained that postmodern is not a new art trend, but a condition. However, in architecture, it became obvious, exemplary in the case of the Centre Pompidou in Paris, that the prefix post means not after, as aftershave, for instance, but the last period of a longer unit in time, and that was in this case the modernism. The building of Centre Pompidou is postmodern because it contains the last rest of functionalism. When I think that we in Hungary live in a post-socialist and post-communist era, I don't agree with some politicians in Hungary who proudly declare that they defeated post-socialism, post-communism. I argue that we still live together with the rest of it, with the rest of communism or socialism. In this sense, I affirm that post-contemporary is built up on the existing rests of 1. Contemporary, 2. Post-modern, and 3. Post-socialism. In the last decades especially, and during the whole 20th century in general, zeitgeist and art history was playing with the several basic prefixes. The problem started from modernism and in more large sense from the experiments of periodization in history, human sciences and art. Late 19th century avant-garde meant modernization in art, but modernism was linked with the age after Middle Age, then Industrial Revolution, and the word modern appeared already in the Middle Ages as modo moderno. In the 20th century, we differentiate in classic modern. These are the early isms, modern as modernist, and postmodern. It's mostly in the museum strategies. Today, in human sciences, we are speaking on second modernity, the first one being the post-industrial society was very important in the 60s, and now I read in newspaper that Łódź is a post-industrial cultural center in Poland. It's normal. Modern became more and more a category of value or asset as new, progressive, actual. After Second World War, consequently emerged art of today, actual art, living parallelly with the notion of avant-garde art, arriving to contemporary art in the late 80s, and appreciate very, very much that Bojana told that probably in Serbia and Croatia and Yugoslavia was used the word sovremene umenije, which means contemporary art already in the 70s. And now already in the 60s.
Already in the early 60s.
Early, very good. And then I have to underline that all Soros sentence was SCCFA, which meant contemporary art. Very important. A new trend for contemporary art started in the 80s already. The fourth conflict with the prefix neo was established between avant-garde and neo-avant-garde of the 60s. Already around the 20s, neo-classicism was establishing, including Picasso or Chirico or even Neue Sachlichkeit, but neo-avant-garde, at least in Hungary, contains some negative meaning. It's only a recycling of the original one, the original avant-garde, it was said. In the 60s, nouveau réaliste in France, neorealismo in Italy, neodada for pop art, also post-painterly abstraction in the States. With Happening and Fluxus, anti-art was introduced. On the trace of it, concept art and conceptualism was born in the 60s, together with project art, land art, actionism, and so on. Together with postmodern, a lot of new terms emerged. The New Age, as a kind of ideology of the whole postmodern, started in the mid-70s, symbolically with the film Hair, as end of the age of the fish, which was meant as Christianism, and emerging and beginning of the new area of Waterman. Waterman is 100% New Age. In the art, new painting, neo-geo, nova figurazione, nova figurace, Czech, after the Italian, Croatian, nova tendencia, better to say Croatian, Yugoslavian, Italian, and international, nouvelle tendance in geometry and kinetic art, and later in computer art. Trans-avant-gardia of Bonito Oliva appeared also at the end of the 70s, and together with trans, we use also today transnational. In the 80s, I organized both in Budapest and Vienna exhibitions undertitled Post-Conceptual Tendencies. Nowadays, and another term is used, neo-conceptual, which is, in my opinion, not yet achieved. So post-conceptual is okay, but neo-conceptual is a dream or a vision for the future. We arrive to the point of a semantical conflict between new, neo, and post. And maybe if it will be published, I will try to make a chart of these prefixes, which became very, very complicated for the beginning of the 20th century. New means for me brand new. Neo, something which was sometime and again recycled. Post means after, but keeping one part of the former one. Post-history in the framework of postmodern means Fukuyama, Huntington, and even Belting. Post-structuralism in the framework of postmodern includes Death of the Author by Roland Barthes and and gender again, heritage science, and even deconstruction. Postgraduate, post-war, post-industrial society, and so on. Young as British, young British art. Earth and Young as a very important institution doing monetary policy, but some time to time supporting young and earnest art. Trans-avant-garde of Bonito in the framework of postmodern, transnational renaissance, remake, retro, pre-modern, pre-performance, proto-renaissance, and other dimensions of periodization are, which I appreciate very, very much of Maya and Juven folks, Anthropocene in the term Pleistocene, Miocene, Stone Age, and so on. Anthropocene. And it comes over to planetary. As I quoted already, Vasarely tried to introduce it, but he has an enormous ego, and he thought his geometry alone will be able to become a planetary system in art. And now, I try to show you some examples.
Only if you can make it in 5 minutes.
Half minute?
5.
5 minutes? Okay, prima, thank you. Peter Rónai, studio and databank of a post-contemporary artist, Hungarian living in Bratislava, teaching in Košice. His exhibition, during the exhibition, the museum is closed. The tickets can be recycled. Johannes Baden, Sebastian Baden, also from a presentation in Košice, but he is Karlsruhe, ZKM, and deals with this guerrilla art history, theories and practices. And this time I should like to thank to Joanna Sokolowska, because I realized that the Łódź Museum already made a very important atlas of modernity, Atlas Nowoczesności, and this is meant also in the term of post-contemporary. Van Baden, you see, before and after, and before is emergency will replace contemporary, and it's with success. There is after a situation very clear, tabula rasa. Stano Masar, Slovak artist, new pictograms of the last scene from his series of Slovak contemporary art. Ljubomir Dubček, Turn Me Please the Right Way. Also, he waiting for artist's idea. This is, by the way, the Chimera project of Budapest, Bratislava. To the brand new exhibition, Origins originated from originals of a Japanese artist will be in Budapest, opened recently. And now the intolerable image of Kerekes Péter. All the pictures are electronic letters printed out in 2 or 3 centimeters, giving a super picture which is intolerable. in the term was post-contemporary. Lepšení Imre, what does it cost the soup? On downstairs you can check the digital calculations in forint and in euro. What does it cost? The electricity and so on. The same artist sound installation made by pure physical, electrophysical effects. And then is Tomáš Kosás, who was already present in the late 80s with his intermedia sculpture, which is at the same time a postament and a card. He was shown yesterday as installation for communication, and he was at the Venice Biennial. It's a small Warsaw, little Warsaw, Kis Warsaw, the Hungarian couple, to give a body to Nefertiti in Berlin. Okay. I don't want to finish with this because I will, instead of make another thing, the prize, libation, glorify and bless, the bird, conciliate, the cool is Thanksgiving, and the last one, asking for help. Some more remark. Everybody could apply to this grouping. It's not a group and not a tendency, but if somebody wants to join to post-contemporary, apply at me. It will an international committee to judge if it's okay or not, and if some problem, I am behind this secret society to decide. So you have a lot of chance and hope to join. Thank you very much.
I really had a pleasure to moderate this morning session, and I'm very grateful to colleagues because I didn't have to remind them of time, and this is my dream, to finish a presentation in 25 minutes. Would you please sit with us? Are there any questions?
I have a question for Alice Eliot. You said that East European art began to resemble art from the West and became lost in the process. I wonder if this was an ironic statement, or if, because it seems really very problematic for me to say something like this seems to be to completely capitulate to this kind of logic of East and West, which is, I thought, exactly what we don't want to do. And then when did you mean? Do you mean when did it begin resembling? If you were being serious, do you mean in the 80s?
It ought to bother me a bit. Did you refer to form or to the content? Either or, I asked her.
Who? To whom? Thomas?
I saw you. Okay, Thomas.
You have to decide. I'm just, distributing microphone. You are moderating discussion.
I have a question for Laszlo. Laszlo, thanks so much for this extremely interesting paper, about the problems of periodization. But I must say, it got me a bit confused because on the one hand, you argue against this kind of orthodox mode of semantical diachrony in periodization, but on the other hand, right, you yourself 2 years ago coined a completely new term, post-contemporary. So, why did you decide to play that game, of adding on new terms instead of just deciding to criticize it from within?
You write down the questions and then maybe collect many questions that you will. Was it, is this the way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the neighbor.
I can't see anything.
Yeah, but this is the neighbor, yeah.
Thank you. I have a question for Alice. You said you were talking about global proliferation of Balkan art. So I was wondering whether you could make some example about that. And then a question to Magdalena. I'm just curious, the artists you were mentioning, do they have any market or are they represented by any gallery at all, whether in the West or in the East?
Jana?
For the remark to Laszlo regarding the atlas of modernity, in which we were working recently in our museum, I don't think that I could agree that we took up this post-contemporary perspective or postmodern. It's quite contrary. The point of departure for our work is that modernity is an unfinished project. It was very much in tune with Marshall Berman, all what is solid melts into the air. We just wanted to continue with the help of contemporary art certain contradictions, fights that were at work, that started, which Berman and also Marxist workers, thinkers described, and we don't think that they are post. We just put contemporary art, maybe not in the context of art historical narratives. This is true. This is difference, but. We put them in the heart of the modern project, actually, contemporary art.
This was for Laszlo, yeah?
It was for Laszlo? The question for Laszlo? Jana?
Yes.
Okay, for Laszlo, yeah. This is my outline. If I may suggest.
I would like to ask Alice to comment on Laszlo's proposal of post-contemporary.
Good question.
Also a question for Aleš, or maybe also somehow combining two of the titles or approaches. So this thing of 2008 that Magda suggests as a starting point for talking about the present situation, and whether the model that Aleš you gave, also talking about Eastern Europe as vanishing, so Eastern Europe is slowly vanishing. You quoted Todorova on that, whether that situation goes up to the present, or whether with the financial crisis in 2008 and other crises we could imagine, we could mention around ecological crisis intensifying and so on, whether that situation has changed, whether we can still talk about the vanishing of Eastern Europe, or can we talk about the return of the spectre of Eastern Europe, or the return of Eastern Europe in different forms from from the imagery of the East European in, say, the UK. Suddenly there's this fear of East Europeans coming, so there's this old model of the East European other returning in political public discourse and sort of public fears and public imaginary, or in also in Eastern Europe, in the return of various political forms which bear some resemblance to the kind of authoritarian models of the socialist era.
Christoph.
Thank you. My question is to Magdalena. I would like to ask that if you suggest that we couldn't criticize the capitalism or the globalization from within, what do you think which are the possible practices for artists or for art historians to make a critique from a new point?
I don't see anyone. So maybe there will be answers, yeah.
Yeah, I think that we can finish with this first tour of questions, because I also have some questions, but I would like to ask them after the first round. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I'm sorry. No, I think you understood the order. The first question was addressed to you, so. Sorry.
So the first question, if I understood it correctly, was what arguments do I have for the thesis that East European art has become started more and more to resemble art from Western Europe? I think this is pretty obvious. I think that if you look at art from the late 80s in different Eastern European countries and compare it with what these people do nowadays, I think it's pretty obvious that they are doing something very different. This is a kind of a natural process. It was not criticism on my part. I think it is a part of a natural process since you have a convergence of Eastern and Western Europe in many respects. So I don't consider this to be a very revolutionary statement in any way. Also, I'm not saying that this is something negative. What I'm saying is, or what I have implied, was that in the early 90s, there have been, at least I know from my own experience, there were quite a few people in Western Europe who expected a new type of art to emerge from Eastern Europe. And it happened to some extent, but certainly not as much as it happened at the time of the October Revolution. That would be my response to the first question. The second question would be the relation, how this affected form and content, or whether it concerned form.
What did you mean?
Yeah. So you insist on the form and content?
It's
Opposition?
a distinction. Do you think that
I find it,
they resemble, like, because they deal with the same themes, or
I think
because
both.
they use the same technology?
I think we should speak both of form and content.
Yeah.
I don't see a difference.
Good.
Okay.
The answer already. Thank you.
Yeah. Then the next question I did not really get, I don't think I wrote everything that was asked. The question was about the global proliferation of which kind of art?
No, Claudia. You have to take the mic. We cannot hear you.
Yeah, you said there were a global proliferation of Balkan art.
Balkan art?
Balkan art, yes.
No, not Balkan. East European.
Oh, okay. So I got it wrong.
Yeah.
So I thought you could make some examples.
I wasn't making this distinction.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Then the next one was so my comment on Laszlo's idea of post-contemporary. I'm very conservative, I must admit, and I think that when it comes to theory, we have to be. You're also very conservative.
Thank you. Nobody noticed
But I'm
that
conservative
before.
in a positive sense. Just joking. I know. Yeah. So I think that we must be very, very careful when we introduce new concepts. And this would be the main reason why I have my problems with the notion of post-contemporary, especially since in the last 10 years, it was actually the notion of contemporary that acquired a kind of a philosophical and theoretical support. I'm here referring mostly to Belting, I'm referring to Arthur Danto, and I'm referring to Terry Smith. But we could, of course, find many others, Agamben and so on and so on. So I think that if we, even this introduction of the contemporary is something that has to be worked on in another few years at least. So I think that it's a little early for post-contemporary, to say the least. So I disagree with you, but I'm of course at the same time supportive of any new ideas. I want to say that this idea still requires a lot of theoretical support, which it doesn't yet have. Then the next question was whether this, perhaps using the term vanishing is putting things a little dramatically, but why not? Because in fact, I think this is what is happening. Again, I would not say that if this type of art is vanishing, that this must be something negative. I think that we have a kind of a global proliferation of different kinds of art. We have nowadays the appearance nowadays. I mean, since '89, to be precise, we have a global proliferation of Chinese art and so on and so on. So I think that perhaps in comparison with these new trends that are emerging in some countries in the world, what has been happening in Europe is no longer as visible as it used to be 10, 15 years ago. I think I covered more or less. Thank you.
So I'm going to merge both questions because they are related. The second question, how it is possible to criticize global capitalism from the inside. I'm thinking about the form of the work. For instance, applying as a tool of the work the tool of advertisement, and it is done by popular group. They simply ordered an advertisement of communism, for instance. This is done very often, or they use the tools like boxes, the Estonian example I gave you just on the screen. And so what they did, they confused the labels of on the boxes in order to just discuss with automatic perception of what we are living in. But I was also referring to the book by Antonio Negri, which is very pessimistic, which is, to me, it's the worst book I have ever read, like the most pessimistic book. Because Negri, in this book written in 2008, Goodbye Mr. Socialism, claims that now we transferred from the material labor to mental labor. So for instance, intellectual labor is considered by him to be mental labor, and we are not dependent thus on the means of production which are in possession of capitalists. And that's not true, simply because for me, living in Central Eastern Europe, I'm completely dependent on this means of capitalism. I don't have access to libraries, which my colleagues have, and etc., etc. So this is a rubbish. So he claims we are not dependent on the means of production anymore, and we can in fact criticize capitalism from the positions of capitalism. And it was criticized highly by Badiou and Zizek, both of them, and I think rightly. But the question is not rather if we can do it from the inside, but if we are condemned to it, to criticize from the inside, if there is no way around the system. And according to the artists, let me give you two examples of contrary examples. The one is Tonel Rander, who is an Estonian artist, and for instance, he refuses even to sell his works. He never sells his works. He creates them very cheaply, and for him it's important not to be represented and not to sell his works. And Senthubi also is not represented artist, but from the other hand, for instance, the whole Arab Spring and Egyptian street art, which is very anti-capitalist and revolutionary. It is simply maybe not so easy to be sold since it's a street art, but it's very popular and entered the market, and it is done after the market. So it is a problem generally. And Slavs and Tatars, represented by Raster Gallery, for me also this is an extreme example, because for me it's like a seeming art, like a mock art, and I'm completely devastated by the fact that you can criticize capitalism apparently and be on the market and achieve high prices, and for me it's like an absurd. So it differs. I would like to Laszlo Becker add a remark, if I might. that I don't think that this vehicle by Kosach would be done in late 80s, as you claim, because he was born in 1978. So in late 80s he would be 10 or 8 or something like this. So I think it was done in early 2000 and something. Yeah.
Maybe this is the most interesting question, because I put him and his early work in my school book on art history as a last one for the future. 26 years ago. It was the last picture in 26 ago. So you can count, I can't.
He was 10. Yeah, he was 10, because he's my age. 26 years.
Impossible. It has to be more. It's about 40.
No, it's about Tomasz Kosach. He is my age, exactly my age, born in 1978. So he's 36 now, and 26 years ago he was
I think it's a biological secret. Later I will check it and I tell you the result. But thank you very much for the question. I try to answer all these questions in 3 very different answers. Starting Tomasz, who spoke about a kind of contradiction in my former 2 years ago and so on my strategy, and he has absolutely right. I think it's no problem to work with contradictions. In this case, I could quote Hegel. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Serious now.
In this case. But if we speak about globalization, we have to understand that all new discourses in the last 10 years was around mondialisation, und Globalisation. This is one thing. There is another one introduced mostly by Belting, world art or global art. And he arrived in Nuremberg CIHA Congress to a kind of compromise, quoting Chinese artist who was ironizing on our Western kind of art history books, making an installation. No, this is a third version, world or international. And we were speaking about universal art 30 years ago or 40 years ago. Universe means also cosmos and planet. And also in this discourse is a total confusion when I have something very slowly and very loud voice. If you remark this diagram of the Little Warsaw with death and life, I try to put a Christian idea of universal instead of him. And as I remember, Catholicism had the same meaning. And I started from this. I know that nobody wants to mention religion and such kind of stuff, but I try slowly and so. Now, the problem is again that Lyotard. Lyotard is out of fashion, but I still remember that he told disappeared le grand récit, le grand discours disappeared, and he meant in this mostly Christianism and Marxism. This was the grand récit in his time. It was the big discourse, And then Marxism is coming back, and I think Christianism is also not died. Again, an answer to Alish. He quoted Belting and other people due to that. My favorites were, during the time, Belting, for me too, Virilio, or Virilio, Harry Seaman, concerning the curatorial discourse and art history, and then Jupp Chesterton. I think there are some people who knows about Chesterton from the beginning of the 20th century. Later we can explain why. Meanwhile, I was, and I am avant-garde, not postmodern, and I keep the Dadaist tradition, like Paul Feyerabend, who spoke always a Dadaist epistemology. And again, Piotr Piotrowski, who is my master in the last 4 or 5 years, introducing these new ways and new methods in art history and contemporary art. Now, one word to Joanna, that it's her right to accept that in which there is a pretty nice post-contemporary practice with exhibition, because they try to go out from this boring art concept and go forward, crossing the borders of art. Only that's it. And also my postmodern strategy, post-contemporary strategy means that I support contemporary as well. I am not against postmodern, I am not against anything, I am not anti, but I for, and I accept them. It's also a contradiction maybe, but not for me. Again. Magdalena and Alex both, that if they attacks me, I told, okay, I accepted absolutely the criticism and I put in my theory. And the last thing I asked meanwhile, are you really a Marxist? She told, absolutely. And I told, I am absolutely not Marxist, but we can be very good working together and to agree in anything. So, and that's my contribution to the debate.
Alish, you wanted to add?
Yes.
No, Alish didn't finish it.
I just wanted to ask Magdalena something. And let me start with what, where Laszlo has finished. You posed the question whether she's a Marxist. There's a big problem with this notion. Why? Because we know that Marxism, during its history, was everything from Marxism of the 19th century, it was revisionist Marxism, it was anthropological Marxism, it was late Marxism attached to late Marx, and so on and so on. So I have a problem with this notion of the term Marxism, as I have it with the term post-Marxism. Because first I think we have to clarify the first one, then we can speak about the second one. Then the other possible approach is to say these and these authors are the people that I have in mind. So my question would be, I saw the ongoing project, perhaps, that you have also mentioned, is a monograph on post-Marxism, which means that probably you will be analyzing, choosing, and so on, certain concepts from the history of Marxism or the present situation in post-Marxism. So, to make a long story short, or finally to ask you the question, can you explain me which authors you have in mind when you speak about post-Marxism? You mentioned Negri, you mentioned Badiou, you didn't mention Rossier, you mentioned Slavoj Žižek. Would these be the persons, or some of them only?
Like we discussed, I think yesterday evening, yes, this is completely typical in literature. Names like Badiou, Žižek, Rancière, Laclau, Mouffe, Balibar, they are considered Negri, Harden Negri, Deleuze, yes, Guattari even, they are considered post-Marxism. Some of them, like Laclau, Mouffe, more radical, Badiou, they are also considered neo-Marxist. I consider them all post-Marxism, so it's nothing not typical about my attitude towards that. It's like I respect the literature in these terms. One interesting example I consider Marxist, which is very controversial, is Leszek Kołakowski, because I consider him a Marxist thinker, and I'm interested in his works in these terms, but everything else is very typical, and it's like...
May I reflect on exactly? My question is that I learned full Marxism during 15 years. Then in '67 I went to France and got French, German and so on, who the next year became heroes of the '68 in Paris, and they was enthusiastic about Marxism, but it was called New Left later, and I still told them, people, take care. I know what Marxism is, and they wanted to do something else. And the next one, what is October Review? Is Marxist or not Marxist? Because I studied and I think they make also a kind of post-Marxism. And what are you confessing is totally brand new in comparison with old Marxism and so on. So it's, we are absolutely okay. Fine.
I would just like to pose a question concerning Marxism, post-Marxism. Would you agree if I were to say that what is typical of post-Marxism is that it retains the notion of class struggle, or would you disagree?
Yeah, it depends on the author, because some authors...
No, I would like to hear your position on this.
It's a very good question. It's a very good question.
Yeah, but it's very differentiated, for instance.
No, but what do you think? Do you think that class struggle is essential?
No, it's not.
For your theory?
It's not.
But can
from my point of view.
Yes.
But I include authors, both those who find it essential and those who...
I don't think you can.
But I do.
I think that you have, I think this is the watershed. Either you accept class struggle or you reject it.
No, I personally accept it, but I also write about authors who reject it.
No, I understand that you write about them, but I was asking what you think.
Yeah.
Because you will be writing or you will write a monograph on.
Class struggle is something which is obvious, and I would be insane to reject it.
We have two other terms. One is radical theory, the other is critical theory, and you can accept either one or the other without accepting the notion of class struggle. Because as you will remember, in the 60s, Roger Garaudy was mentioned. I think yesterday it was such an example. He was a person who rejected class struggle. People who were anthropological Marxists, to a large extent, rejected class struggle. And I think that class struggle is, as Roger Garaudy would say, a touchstone of Marxism. Without class struggle, no Marxism.
Yeah, I would agree.
Katarzyna.
Katarzyna?
Katarzyna, over there. Katarzyna.
Okay.
Hello. I have a really simple comment, no, like completely simple on Aleš, no, and the question of westernization of Eastern European art, or it's more rather about westernization of Eastern European artists, because a Slovak artist, Alex Mlinaček, it's a story, no, met his friend Ilya Kabakov in New York, in front of the Rockefeller Center in the 90s. After Kabakov's success in the US, and Mlinaček told to me that he didn't recognize him because Kabakov was dressed up as a cowboy, all in jean with a cowboy hat and so on. And Ilya told to him, "Now look what they did to me. No? They even changed my teeth." Thank you.
I have one remark to Magdalena, sorry. I find your final remark about art market extremely simplifying and unjust. You brought examples of very successful artists like Dan Bożowski, whose nature of work is of course different. This is more like ephemeral drawings. They are less. They don't have this obvious character of the commodity of the object, but they are available in private collections, in the museums, and so on and so forth. And I think that, of course, the art market is extremely corrupt and it's problematic and full of contradictions. But I wouldn't externalize the evil over there, like those artists who I wouldn't deprive artists who participate in it of any agency, legitimacy, or ethical stance. We all here sell our services. We are intellectual laborers, and we cooperate with corrupt or increasingly neoliberal universities, museums. And I don't think that the sheer fact that somebody is selling artworks in the market, and in particular in the countries where there are not so many alternatives right now, like as we know, artists very small percent can participate in the market, and most of the artists have no stable sources for incomes, and they try different ways to make their living. I wouldn't accept the stance that we should expect artists that they should starve. That's my remark.
Mara is.
There are more questions, and I have
there's
comments
Mara.
when you
There's
finish.
Mara.
I had a question also to Magdalena Radomska, and basically most of your examples came from white cube spaces. I wanted to ask about your agenda working with like art as it's defined by the white cube probably, and like your distinction between art and activism, which maybe implies more this external critique of capitalism, or maybe assumes more this position of the external critique. But you have chosen to work in this very contradictory like field, approaching the art practices. So I wanted to ask, what's your agenda exactly on this, like you're working in your field, basically?
Maybe some more questions. Okay.
I can see myself.
Sure.
I just want to teach younger colleagues. I would like to give a lesson to younger colleagues, because when I was as young as you, I did the same mistake. This is about an art historian who should keep his mind forever, you know. There was one music critic in Belgrade, Gostushki, and his 30-year activity in this field was celebrated in Belgrade, and he said something, and when I heard this, it made me afraid. He said, in 30 years, I didn't change my mind about anything, meaning what he thought about Beethoven or whomever. And then I really became frightened. If this happens to me, you know, then I just have to leave the field, you know. We have rights to develop. There are no books, there are no I mean, and maybe it's too personal what I say, but we must change. Otherwise, we are dead when we are 60. Good. Now I have to tell you something that is very, very personal, and I have to list just a couple of identities I have to assume since 1899. First, my identity was post-communist, then post-Yugoslav, then post-war, post-Balkan, now post-Eastern European, post-feminism I don't accept, and I cannot wait to become post-global. Sorry. So we didn't come to this stage yet. And the question is, now for Aleš, or probably we were talking about globalization and so on. I always ask myself, are we still probably under-globalized? Maybe not globalized enough? So, Aleš, when you teach Croatian students in Shanghai, I presume, are they interested in any way about this side of Europe? They must be interested in Europe, of course.
You're referring to globalization?
No, when you teach in Shanghai, you teach foreign students, do you? And are they interested, I mean, first of all, do you teach about Eastern Europe? And if you do, are they interested in it?
Yes.
Okay, this is the question, thank you.
I would just like to add something, if I may, and that is, you spoke about globalism. I had, a year ago, I edited a volume devoted to globalism, and 2 contributions were by Chinese colleagues, and it was interesting to see a very different perspective on globalism. When we speak about globalism, we have in mind American interpretations, European interpretations, and we take this for granted. We think this is the end of the story. There are no other options. There are.
They are.
Yeah, and as I said, the Chinese, perhaps also Russian, I don't know that, but certainly the Chinese position is very different. And they see things through different eyes. And I must say that on the basis of those 2 contributions, I was able to take another position, another viewpoint, because this is the third, so to say, partner, or the third person taking part in this discussion about, not only discussion, but also practice, and politics, because globalism is not just theory, it's not just the humanities, it is actually what is happening in economy, in society, in the world as such.
We still have 8 minutes. Piotr talk.
I should like to confess you that I am art historian, and I cannot be post-historian, you know. As Bojana explained, that post-war, post are all together in me as well, and no excuse. I am very fresh to accept new ideas, but somewhere I should like to work on art, because I am art historian. But I have to accept the past. I cannot forget the whole. And that's why my quotation was Chesterton. We told the revolution is not to make tabula rasa, but to continue to solve the problems. So revolution means not to negligate and liquidate and defeat everything what was before, but continue the open questions to answer.
Aleš, take microphone, please.
No, I just wanted to add that what you were describing now is a reform. It's not a revolution.
More than a reform.
You can have reform, you can have revolution, you can have
something new.
Less than revolution is not good enough. I will answer the question, but Joanna, Yes, I agree with you partially. I mean, I meant only a group of artists like Slavs and Tatars, which are devastating example for me. Not everyone which is selling the art, of course, but those who are producing, according to my judgment, products which criticize capitalism. And I've seen their works, which are products, market products criticizing capitalism. So now they are selling the criticism of capitalism, and I've seen those examples also at the numerous exhibition at Saatchi in London. So for me, those are like, I'm condemning this type of art. But of course, not everyone who sells, because this is very difficult situation, and I'm not judging because of the amount of money they earn, but rather the stance, which of course it's only my interpretation and my judgment, but I'm doing for my sake. And as it comes to the white cube, it was a marginal question which appears within my interpretation, but I think that what needs to be added about the white cube is that it covers with a layer of paint, as I said, also the work of the worker who is preparing the gallery. Because when Saint-Hubert exhibited literally in the room, which were, these rooms were very destroyed. They literally had holes in the walls, and they were very not prepared. And when I was analyzing this art without intention to enter the discourse of the white cube, I discovered that it enters that discourse, and that it reveals that white cube also polished with white paint the work of proletariat, who is working also for the gallery and to prepare the exhibition. And that's it.
Okay. May I just have one sentence before you close it?
Always.
I'm sorry, after so many years I take part in a mixed gender conference, and it's a pleasure to be with the boys. But nevertheless, I have to mention something that was not mentioned so much during these 3 days, and this is, for instance, feminist reading of globalization. And I cannot quote you the authors because they are in computer, but there is again concerning the role of the nation state or state per se and the market in feminist reading of these two, let's say, entities. State is read in feminine terms and the market is read in masculine terms, meaning there is always somebody who suffers more from this content realism I quoted the other day. Thank you very much for staying with us, and again, in the name of all participants, thank you to Labirynt team, and thank you to Piotr for coming to this idée géniale.
I'm not going to conclude this conference. Of course, this is maybe not conclusions should be provided, but rather the opening. And as you probably share my opinion, that this conference was a lot of new ideas have been provided here, but also new materials that I would like to stress. It's not only ideas, but also many new materials. Empirical materials or historical materials should be were provided here. And of course, there's, as Bojana said, a lot of things is lacking here in this conference, but this is obviously. But this is I think, for me, it was a great experience, and that was because of you. And I'd like to thank all of you speakers who were contributed this 3-day session, 4-day session, 4-day session, and as well as the organizers of this conference. Without you, Waldek Tatarczuk and the whole staff, including Alexandra Skrabek, this conference would not take place. There was a perfect organization.